Wild Geese, as I said, is one of my favorite poems. There's something about letting go of those things that weigh us down, those despair, that regrets, loneliness. And to just notice that you're part of this world that does go on, and it will go on no matter what you feel, but you belong here, all of who you are part of this world. It's this beautiful reminder that we are animals who belong here, just as much as the wild geese. But I don't know about wild geese, but I know we humans, we carry this heaviness sometimes around in our bodies. Small or large, they can weigh us down, make us feel like we're walking for 100 miles, repenting on our knees. Those things that weigh us down, wouldn't it be great if we could just go back and change the past, right? Wouldn't it be great if we had like a Control-Z button? You guys know what I mean by a Control-Z button? Most of you know this, right? On your computer, you've got a Control-Z, and on most applications, it's the undo button, right? You just get to undo something that you've done. Undoes your life, because we all know that feeling that you had, that, oh man, that horror, that moment when you realize you've done something or you could have done it differently. Now, I've never actually, let me go back. So, I've never actually gone off a cliff, but I have been in a fender bender, and this is actually what I remember thinking to myself, Control-Z, Control-Z. I was in a parking lot, I was busy at work, and a friend at lunch had asked me to go help her with an errand, and okay, fine, and I dropped her off someplace, and I came rushing back because I had so much work to do. Now, normally I'm a very conscientious driver, and I look behind myself when I pull out of parking, right? I pulled in, and I wanted to straighten myself out, and I didn't. I heard that crunch. Oh, you know that, yeah. Oh, I should remember thinking, Control-Z, Control-Z, can I just undo that? Please. You know, I had to face the music. I remember the guy was very upset with me. It turned out he was the head of HR at AT&T. And I pushed into the company I was working for at the time. I was like, all right, he was a little upset, but he calmed down after a little bit. He realized I was immediately apologizing. It was my fault. I totally owned up for it. And I paid for it, you know, and had insurance and all those things. And we moved on with our lives, and we actually got to the point where we could kind of wave to each other in the hall. But not all of these regrets, not all of these things can really be forgotten. Sometimes there's really big things. Maybe there are words that just can't be taken back. Like maybe you spit in somebody's face. Violence that can't be taken back. Promises broken, or when we let ourselves down. How do we cope with those things that weigh us down, that stay with us? I remember when I lived in Australia for a couple of years, one of the things that fascinated me was that in Australia they went from being the absolute worst record of drunk driving of any Western nation to the best. And I found out why when I was there, is because they have these commercials on the television that they show. And I was going to bring one here today, I was going to show it to you, and I couldn't get through it. And I remember I had a really hard time ever getting through it. And it's not that they're gory. They don't show gory things or the crashed car or anything like that. What they show actually is not the victim, but the perpetrator, the person who was drunk driving. They show them at that moment when they go from a happy person to realizing what they've done. And that moment on their face, that realization, that horror that comes across them. And all of us have experienced or can imagine experiencing something so awful. And reaching into understanding that going to that core of that emotional part is why they were incredibly effective commercials. If you want to go out on YouTube, just Google Australian commercial drunk driving, and you will find them. And they have a montage of what they've done from the last 20 years or something like that. I couldn't get through it. These commercials, they focus on people. How do you live when you know that you've done something so horrible? Something that words cannot describe. How How do you live with that? In theological terms, we're talking about redemption. Can someone ever be redeemed for something like that? Can we make up for the past? Can you take back what's been done? And I think this is a really important question to answer because, we have this sixth principle that we've been studying, this goal of a world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all, right? Boy, talk about a high bar. I like high bars. I like going for it. But man, that is a high bar. We need to be able to ask this question because there's been so much horror and pain in the past between racism, violence against women, genocide, murders, all these things. How do we cope with this past, these regrets, these horrors that the past has brought up? How we deal with it now, I think the battery must be there, there we go, is our justice system, is what's called a retributive justice system. It says you have to pay for what you've done in a kind of eye for an eye type of way. In other words, if you've done something to you that at least as worse has been that you did to someone else. So we don't really know how to do that, so we just sort of shove people aside into buildings. We exile them, lock them away. We don't really give them any skills on how to cope with this. The victims really don't feel much better. They're bitter, maybe angry. There's no sense of healing going on. There's just revenge, which is based in hatred, not compassion. And perpetrators don't learn anything. They aren't given skills to grow. They go back into their system. They're thrown back into the system that doesn't support any conversion or change. This is why we have the highest rate of recidivism of almost any country, 52%. Means after 3 years in our prisons, this isn't even our jails, this is our prisons, 50% of the perpetrators will be back in prison. And I remember a story that I heard years ago about a man who had a rather checkered past, would be saying it lightly, but he joined AA and he realized that he needed to make changes. And step 9 of AA says, make direct amends to the people whenever possible, those that you have harmed, except when it would injure them or others. Well, he should have included himself a little bit on that, because he wrote a letter to a woman that he had sexually assaulted and apologized and said, I'm so sorry, please forgive me for this. Well, she took that letter to the police, and he was arrested. Now, I'm willing to bet that there's probably 2 camps in this room when you hear that story, because this is sort of the reaction that most of the world had. One was saying, good for her. I mean, justice needs to be served. And then there's another camp that says, but the poor guy, he was trying to change, he was apologizing. I can understand her wanting to do that, to want to lash out, to have revenge, to make someone pay. But I also believe that he kind of wanted a little bit of a Control-Z, right? He just wanted to be able to send a letter and then that would be it. But it doesn't work that way. She said, mercy is for him, justice is for me. But no one's been healed. There's no healing involved for her or for him. Both sides are still hurting. And I wonder if there's a different way. In Christianity, so in the theology of Christianity, there's a huge and wonderful, deep understanding around forgiveness. In some forms of Christianity, however, that forgiveness is for all sins, and it's sort of a wipe clean, you got new slate, right? All you have to do is ask for it, or maybe you confess your sins, and you get sort of a clean slate. You're done. You don't have to worry about it anymore. This is why in jails, when I was there was a lot of jailhouse conversions, right? Because isn't that great? You get to just say, oh, I'm sorry, and then you don't have to feel bad about it anymore. You don't have to feel guilty or anything like that. Sort of a clean slate. It's kind of like having a Control-Z button. And Jesus does say in Matthew 18, he says, forgive 70 times 7 times. In other words, just keep forgiving. But forgiveness is not about a lack of responsibility or asking people to take responsibility for something that's been done. It's about a lack of anger or hatred. It's letting go of that anger. So I don't buy into this kind of Control-Z form of redemption. It's a little bit like letting people off the hook. It means you don't have to change. The person doesn't have to change or maybe even learn from their mistakes. I think a healthy theology of redemption is about healing what is broken. And Buddhism doesn't really have a theology of redemption per se, but they have a philosophy. They see people as they are now, not as they've been, allowing them to change, kind of like in our story today. Redemption for Buddhists is not about exile or punishment or even forgiveness per se. It's a process of healing. Let me tell you a little story. This is a famous story in Buddhism about a guy named Angulimala. Let's see if I can pronounce this correctly. Angulimala was a brilliant child, one of those child prodigies. Unfortunately, became the object of jealousy by his fellow students. And the students then turned the teacher against him. So the teacher wanted to sort of trick Angulimala and gave him an impossible task. He said, if you want to honor me, which in the Buddhist tradition, to honor your teacher was basically how you, to a certain extent, give them a gift, was certainly how you graduated. And it was absolutely vital that someone do that. Otherwise, he would go home in shame if he couldn't give an offering to his teacher. So the teacher said, I want you to give me 1,000 fingers. Not just any fingers, the index fingers. So he thought, well, that's going to be impossible for Angulimala to do, so therefore he's going to go home in shame, and this would shame Buddha, or Angulimala. So Angulimala was trapped in this sort of honor your teacher and don't hurt anyone. He is, after all, a Buddhist. But he decides to honor his teacher, so he goes out and he starts killing people for their fingers, because people were a little reluctant to give them up. So he's killing hundreds of people. And he waits for them in ambush. He builds this horrific reputation of as a mass murderer. And no one can do anything to stop him. He's so strong and he's so clever. And he gets so inured to his way of life that he sees his own mother coming to talk with him that he decides he's going to commit matricide, which in Buddhist culture is like one of the absolute worst things you could ever do. Well, the Buddha had heard of Angulimala, and he sees what's happening, so he steps in between the two before Angulimala can commit another murder, and evades him very easily. Angulimala chases after Buddha, who seems to always be just stay out of reach. So you can imagine here's Angulimala coming after the Buddha, and Buddha's just like sidestepping very nicely out of the way. So finally, in frustration, he says, stop! To which the Buddha replies, I have stopped. It's you who have not stopped. Angulimala replies, well, I'm the one standing and you're the one who's moving away. To which the Buddha says, I say this because I have stopped violence in my heart, but it runs out of control in you. Now this seems to have had a profound effect on Angulimala. And as conversion stories go, Angulimala immediately gave up his horrific ways and decided to dedicate himself as a life as a monk. But that's not the end of the story. Angulimala, now as a monk, must beg for his food, which is the Buddhist tradition. He returns to the villages he's haunted as a mass murderer. The villagers see him coming, they throw stones at him, they beat him, they call him names, they ignore him. As a monk, the villagers know that they can't kill him because that would be sacrilegious. But they're horrified and appalled that he could just sort of get away with what he's done. And for Angulimala, he knows that he can never make up for what he's done. All he can do is show up and show how he's changed. That he's no longer that person that he was. So he shows up every day with his begging bowl and his hand out in supplication. He doesn't even ask for forgiveness because he knows that that would be impossible. As he comes to them every day, he gets to know them. He sees the pain he's caused. And they begin to know him and see how he's changing. And slowly, over time, the villagers begin to feed him. They begin to let go of that anger, to forgive. Recognize that the person that he was is not the same person that he is. Like the Buddha said in our story today, each of them is a river, never the same one twice. Both sides of different people, both now without violence in their hearts. Angulimala can never buy back the lives he took. He can only to learn to live differently. And I love this story because neither of them would have changed without the other. In Buddhism, redemption isn't possible, but compassion is. Compassion is what changes a person into something different so that all can heal. Compassion is about getting to know the other person so you understand what they feel, what their pains are. Now, I'm willing to bet that nobody here is a mass murderer, hoping that. But we've all done something that we regret, something that maybe we could do a Control-Z on. You've got to remember that it doesn't define you, those moments. That's the power of the story of Angulimala. It shows that redemption is a process of healing. It's not a Control-Z button. We can't go back to the past. We can only allow the future to unfold, to move forward. There's been 2 headlines in the news this week I've been noticing. 2 police officers were shot in Ferguson while protesters were demonstrating about all of the racism going on there. And the other is the Oklahoma fraternity that was shut down due to a racist video that was filmed. I'm willing to bet that there are people in those situations who wish they had a Control-Z button. But we can't go back. We have to heal what has been broken. Heal the broken trust of the police in Ferguson, the broken trust of racism in our country, the broken trust between the community and the police, the broken trust between the college and that fraternity. I think that there is another way. It's one that's been starting to gain a little bit more foothold here, but it takes a long time. It's called restorative justice. It's not an either-or thing. It's not about justice or mercy. It's on the side of healing. It recognizes that more violence or ignoring pain, it just doesn't work. It takes the victim, the community, and the offender all together in community to work through it. That there is some accountability. There's a way that they work together, sitting down. It takes time. It's a process. It's not just, shove them aside for about 2 years in prison. It's about how do we help them face what we've done, give them the skills, work with the victims to help them with healing, but also work with the community that's been violated as well. I don't know if you know the story of restorative justice. This is an example. This is what happened, how it started. Years ago, it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. I can't remember where. But there were 2 teenage boys, I believe that they were African American, that were, in one night, went around and broke into something like 10 or 11 different houses and stole stuff. And they were teenage, they were like 16, 17 years old, and they went before the judge, and the judge was just like tired of this. Like knew that if I put them in jail, nothing's going to change. They're probably going to end up back doing the same thing. So instead, he went to them and he said, you have to now go back to every single house and the people there, hear their pain, and make amends to each and every single one of them. Pay back all of the windows that you broke, or the doors that you broke, or what you stole, whatever it is. And so those 2 young boys went back to every single household, did exactly that, and they were so changed by that, that one of them, I think, went on to become a lawyer. The other one went on to actually promote restorative justice as one of the founders of restorative justice. There can be a way of healing. It takes time. It's not something we can just shove people aside to. But it's about healing the victim, the perpetrator, and the entire community. Because redemption isn't about, it is about facing what we've done. There's no Control-Z button. And we know that more hatred, more violence doesn't work. The 2 police officers that were shot, that's not helping. That's not doing anything but creating more violence, more anger. Instead, we have to face it together as a community, a way of healing for all the parties. It's each person discovering that they are more than just the one act that they've done. It's a way of finding what's next. What is it that people are trying to say that they can't find the words for? Find ways of not doing it in a harmful and violent way. Angulimala wasn't born evil. Neither was Darren Wilson, or the police officers in Ferguson, nor the people who shot those 2 police officers, nor the frat boys in Oklahoma. They all have the capacity to change and become whole and holy. We all do. I invite you this morning as we sing our closing hymn to think, what's next? How can we build a world community of peace, liberty, and justice when so much hurt has happened? think we begin with ourselves, and then with our communities, then with the world. Step by step. It begins when each of us remember who we truly are. Divine, holy, capable beings of healing and compassion.